So it's great to see all of you this evening. Welcome. My name is Bruce Lennox. I'm the Dean of Science in the Faculty of Science, of course. You might not recognize me because I have my post-lockdown hairstyle, much longer than I usually wear it, but I've been able to participate in Soup and Science in the fall each year for the last 5 years. In fact, this is the 31st edition of Soup and Science, a really important part of the Faculty of Sciences showcasing and highlighting of research from the two students from the perspective of how research actually works. Before we begin tonight's proceedings, I want to acknowledge that McGill is on the land that's long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples, including the Ashkenabic and the Haudenosaunee nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous people whose footsteps have marked this territory in which peoples of the world now gather. This evening, we're going to hear 4 incredible speakers from really representative of the diversity of themes and topics which are in a Faculty of Science. So we have Professor Bärbel Knäuper from the Department of Psychology, Professor Bill Coish from the Department of Physics, Professor Johanna Nešlehová from the Department of Math and Stats, and Professor Brian Robinson from the Department of Geography. So once their presentations are complete, we'll move into the question and answer period of the session. And this is a really interesting part of Soup and Science. Each speaker will be assigned to a breakout room, and you'll be able to choose which rooms you want to visit and join the breakout room and speak to our speakers, ask them questions about how they got into the research that they're doing, specific questions about the research, and even opportunities within the type of research that they do. And a few minutes before 8 p.m., we'll return to the main session for final remarks. Before I begin the presentations and the introductions, rather, I'd like to welcome Principal Suzanne Fortier to the session. It's great to have you with us, Principal Fortier, and I wonder if you could say a few words before we begin.
Merci, Dean Lennox, et bonsoir à vous tous. Welcome to this evening of Soup and Science. I think of the beginning of terms at McGill as being launched with a very exciting event, which is Soup and Science. Every year, I look forward to the events, and of course, every beginning of semester. It's an event that brings us into the path of discovery. We hear from people who are pursuing great research in their own areas, and they bring us along to hear about what they're doing, why it is important, and sometimes they will even tell us about some of their hurdles that they're facing, because as I think every researcher knows, the path of discovery is not a smooth path, often has its own difficulties and hurdles, and many rewards, though, not only for our researchers, not only for our university, but of course for the whole world. So it's a great event. I'm glad that you're joining us. I know there will be more events this week. So I think there's 2 more. So that will give us plenty of chance to hear about various areas of research here. You know, normally we meet in Red Path Museum. It's a beautiful room. It's a part of the heritage building of McGill. It's an old building with a very beautiful room. It's fun to be there. And of course, after we have the presentations, then we go and have our soup. They call it Soup and Science. In fact, it's soup, sandwich, and science. It's fun to mingle with people in the space there and chat and also ask questions, of course, of the researchers who made the presentation. Now, many things have had to be put in the virtual mode right now because, of course, you all know why, because of COVID-19. And it's great that we can meet even in this world, but there are things that are not reproducible in the virtual world. And I'm kind of semi looking forward to a virtual soup. I don't think it's going to be as good as what we have normally, but I hope for all of us that within too long, and again, thanks to research, thanks to innovators, we'll all be able to be together because we will find ways to live with this virus and find ways to get back to a life that is very different than one we have now. And I will say something that I've heard over and over the last several weeks and months, and into an environment that will be built back better. And I think that is, again, a place where many people from our community will contribute, people who are teaching, learning. But I must say to all of our students who are here with us, the world is really betting on you, knowing how you're engaged, how you care about not only your local and global communities, but about everyone in the world. They're really counting on you to build back better this planet on which we all live together. So, bonne soirée à vous tous et on a bien hâte de vous entendre. Alors, je remercie les gens qui font les présentations. Thank you to all of our presenters this evening.
And thank you, Principal Fortier. Great words and a great way to kick off this evening. We'll begin with our first presenter, Professor Bärbel Knäuper. Bärbel.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here today and tell you about innovations in behavioral weight loss programs. You all know that there's a large number of people, unfortunately, who have overweight and obesity. In North America, it's about 60% of the population that has overweight and obesity. And it is a big challenge to get programs to people, all this large number of people in need. Actually, the gold standard for weight loss change are behavioral programs, and this is where psychology, of course, comes in. And the gold standards are intensive behavioral weight loss programs. These are programs that are delivered to people over the course of 1 year in many, many one-on-one sessions. They focus on diet and exercise, and they use cognitive behavioral techniques to change people's behaviors. These programs, the diabetes prevention program in the US is an example of that, are really successful. They lead to clinically significant weight loss of 5 to 9% of initial body weight. But of course, they come at a big price. So they cost around $3,000 per person. This is, of course, absolutely not scalable to the huge number of people who are in need of programs. And so the research we are doing in my lab is really focused on trying to figure out ways to get the programs, make the programs cheaper so that they can be delivered to more people. The challenge is the moment you lower the intensity of these programs, the effects are smaller, people lose less weight. So now clinically significant weight losses are achieved when the programs are done in groups rather than one-on-one, when they are done online rather than in person, and when you shorten the number of sessions and the sessions themselves. This is the challenge. So we have been trying to find solutions to this challenge by creating higher intensity, but in a cheaper way. We, in our lab, try to do this in 3 ways. One is that we focus on the active ingredients of weight loss programs. You can imagine, like in these programs, there might be a lot of stuff in there that is actually not making a difference for weight loss. And so what psychologists are trying to do is to identify the active ingredients of weight loss programs so that one can actually focus on those and get rid of all the stuff that is actually just filler material and is not really helping people to change their eating and their exercising. Another focus is on matching better the interventions with populations. Right now, we often have the situation that everybody's getting the same program prescribed, but not all programs work for all populations. For example, people who eat in response to negative emotions, for them, the traditional cognitive behavioral programs often don't work. The third one is to make interventions more adaptive. With the current technology, we have many, many opportunities to personalize interventions. Everything is moving online due to the pandemic and in general. And so we have now, and we are working on these, the ability to make interventions adaptive in terms of the readiness of the person to change and in terms of the techniques that are being used. So talking about the first focus, the active ingredients, you can't see what's there. This is an example of how psychology is moving into the world of trying to standardize techniques that are being used in behavioral interventions. We are using meta-analyses and other ways to identify what techniques actually are effective. And so based on this, we can then develop interventions that focus on those. We have done this in the McGill CHIP Healthy Weight program, where we focused on self-monitoring, action planning, and combined this with having these delivered by CBT-trained clinical psychology trainees. This was a really successful trial where the participants lost 10% of their weight after 12 months, which is a really extremely high percentage. When you remember 5 to 7% is clinically significant. It lowers the progression of pre-diabetes to diabetes. So with 10% weight loss, one can really have good clinical outcomes. So this is very promising, and we are working on making these programs even more focused and even shorter. The second is, I mentioned, matching interventions with populations. For many individuals, control-based CBT techniques actually work. So self-monitoring, problem solving, action planning, and so on and so forth. But for others, like emotional eaters, people who eat in response to negative emotions, those control-based techniques do not work as well. And so for those populations, which actually are a pretty high percentage, like 25% or so of all people with overweight and obesity, we are developing brief programs that use other techniques, mindfulness-based or ACT techniques that can be used. So they focus less so on controlling one's eating, but rather on a higher awareness of how one eats and changing one's attitude to food and to eating. So we have been developing a couple of brief ACT programs to reduce emotional eating. Sometimes these are done, that has been very successful, at lunchtime with McGill employees who come to us quite briefly once a week for 10 minutes at lunchtime. And these have been shown to be pretty successful in changing emotional eating. Finally, the third focus on trying to make programs intensive but cheaper is developing adaptive programs in the form of apps. There are already a bunch of apps online, and some of them use machine learning to personalize them to the individual. And we are working on improving those programs so that they become even more evidence-based and personalized, so that people can take them into their everyday life. And the program basically learns when one is at risk of overeating or of stress eating and so on, based on one's past, how one has fed the app before, and also potentially physiological feedback that one feeds into the app. And so then the app can personalize, give one tips of what to do or not to do in order to avoid overeating. What makes this interesting is that I think we have to think in terms of getting programs to all people in need in form of a stepped care approach, where we cannot ever think that we can give to all people one-on-one programs with a professional therapist. It's impossible, but that for some people, it will be effective to use these adaptive population-matched e-health interventions that are extremely cheap to roll out to many, many people. If that doesn't work, then a more intensive step could be brief but intensive online group programs, potentially with health coaching. Then one could step it up a notch if that still doesn't work for the person, and offer intensive group programs, for example, group diabetes prevention programs or ACT programs. And then only then, if nothing of this helps a person with obesity, one-on-one programs that have been shown to be very effective could be offered. So to conclude, we have promising avenues. The e-health is of value within stepped care approaches, and we are learning more and more due to machine learning and artificial intelligence how to make these highly personalized so that the techniques are completely adapted to what the person needs and what the person is ready for. The brief but intensive group programs could be really interesting in the stepped care approach, particularly if they adapted to the person, to the population, and intensive group programs that are led by experts in behavior change that focus on habit formation and or emotional eating, as we have shown, are very successful. So the ultimate goal, kind of what drives us in my lab, we have the vision of translating intensive one-on-one psychotherapy like interventions into effective and efficient and thus scalable interventions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Knäuper. Fantastic story, and I'm sure that your breakout room will be filled very quickly. Our next speaker is Professor Bill Coish from the Department of Physics. Bill.
Thank you. So I don't know if I can advance the slides. Maybe it seems to. There we go. Okay. So I know that there are many people out there who are younger and thinking about what they want to do in the future. I was in a similar situation about 20 years ago when I was at the Canadian Undergraduate Physics Conference, trying to think about what I wanted to do in graduate studies. During the conference, I needed to write the graduate record exam, the GRE. This is an exam that people write to go to grad school in the US. And I needed a ride from the conference venue to the exam center. I managed to get a ride from someone from the University of Regina. He gave me a lift in his rusty pickup truck. It probably looked something like this. On the way there and on the way back, we talked about what we wanted to do in the future. And I remember we both had this interest in quantum computing, which was really an emerging field at the time and still has a long way to go before it becomes a mature field. But from then on, I have worked a lot together with my students and postdocs on quantum computation. So a quantum computer is not so different from a classical computer. Just like a classical computer, you boot it up, you prepare it in some initial state, you run some kind of algorithm, and then you look at the outcome to see what the answer to the question is that you want. But what's really different about a quantum computer relative to a classical computer is that a quantum computer is made up of very fragile quantum elements. And because these quantum elements are fragile, you can't imagine simply running the algorithm straight ahead and just measuring once at the end. As the computer gets larger and larger, we think that we would need error correction as we do the computation in a quantum computer. And so this error correction, it involves a sequence of measurements that you do during the computation where you kind of look to see what errors might have occurred. And then you correct those errors, depending on what errors have occurred. And then you do a little bit of the computation. And then you repeat this step over and over and over again. And what's really essential here is that you do many, many, many measurements during the computation. And it turns out that these measurements, these readouts of the quantum bits or qubits can have errors. And those errors can accumulate during the computation. If the error is too large, then your computation is going to give you a nonsense result. But luckily, we have a theorem known as the accuracy threshold theorem that says that provided the error is below a threshold, the error for an elementary operation like in this box is below a threshold value, it turns out you can exponentially suppress the probability of getting the wrong answer at the end of your computation with a polynomial cost in the number of qubits, the size of your quantum computer, and the number of gates, the time it takes you to do your computation. So if you get below this threshold, it's possible that you can grow the size of the computation and quantum computing can be almost as easy as classical computing. So motivated by this, I worked with a graduate student, Benjamin Danjou, who graduated from McGill in 2017, on an idea to improve on quantum bit measurements. And we used something called a soft decision decoder. This is a technique that's known from electrical engineering and signal processing. But in order to make it work, we needed to know something about these probability distributions, and the probability distributions we could only get from doing important theoretical physics. Okay, so we came up with a theory about this about 6 years ago, and it wasn't until about 2 years ago that there was some groundbreaking experiments and the very first general purpose but very small quantum computer that could show the advantage that we suggested would be there. And so we got together with some researchers at the Technical University of Delft who had done these groundbreaking experiments, and over the past year, we've experimentally demonstrated that indeed this advantage can occur. And so if you remember this guy from Saskatchewan in the rusty pickup truck, his name was Chad Rigetti. He also decided to work on quantum computing. And in fact, he became the founder and CEO of a company called Rigetti Computing that is a Silicon Valley startup. And it's received more than $200 million in venture capital so far to develop future quantum computers in competition with Microsoft and Amazon and Google and IBM and startups like Xanadu in Toronto. So I am really excited that my group, which works on fundamental science questions, that the work that we're doing could potentially, change society eventually in the not too distant future through these kinds of real world applications. So thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Bill. Fantastic story. Of course, it's the very first time I've seen the journey start and end in terms of the description in a pickup truck, but why not? It's a wonderful story and wonderful science. Our next speaker is Professor Johanna Nešlehová in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics. Johanna.
There. All right, so hello everyone, good evening. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about some of my work. So I am a mathematical statistician, so my work is a little more theoretical, but still it's quite fun. So let me share some of that with you tonight. So broadly speaking, I'm interested in dependence between random phenomena, and in particular in learning and inferring this dependence from observed data. So when I say dependence, you may probably recall the notion of the correlation coefficient from some of your introductory stats classes or from CEGEP. So that's really a canonical measure of dependence that goes back to one of the fathers of statistics, Karl Pearson. But of course, since then, 100 years later, we know quite a bit more about dependence. So there are much smarter one-number summaries, like one that's called Kendall-Stau, which I will show you a little later. And then there is a whole theory and whole statistical methodology based on copulas, which really provides a rigorous mathematical framework of how to understand and infer dependence patterns between random phenomena. So when I said Kendall-Stau, let me just give you a very quick introduction to what you may want to do. So suppose I want to measure the dependence between two quantities based on some observed data. And so the data are really points in the plane because we have two variables. And what you're interested in is how these points are positioned with respect to each other. So you can fish out one pair of points one at a time and then check whether they are positioned like this, which we call concordant, or like this, which we call discordant. And then you simply go through your sample, you count the concordant pairs and discordant pairs, subtract them from one another, normalize, and that's called Kendall-Stau. So that goes back also to the beginning of the 20th century, and it's actually a pretty good summary of dependence. So why do I want to talk to you about Kendall-Stau? I want to share one of the projects I've been doing in recent years with you, and the story is as follows. So if you calculate Kendall-Stau between two quantities, then a lot is known about that. It's not super exciting. But when it gets really interesting is when you have many, many variables. And that happens nowadays because we collect data on so many different things. And they have so many complex dependence patterns that this arises very quickly. So I have an example here from finance, but you can use the same technique in other areas too, like in genetics, for instance. So here I have 107 financial stocks from the Nasdaq index. And you can, your people are interested in how they depend on one another, in particular if they want to calculate financial reserves, because sometimes they're impacted by the same events, and a lot of the stocks may drop simultaneously, which can lead to bankruptcy, for instance. So this is a serious concern, and we need to understand how these stocks interact with one another. So what I did here, I just calculated Kendall's Tau for every pair of these stocks. And now, of course, you have many pairs, you have over 5,000 such pairs. And if I just depict these correlations in the picture, that's what you see on the slide, this green matrix of taus that are just coded with a color. So the darker the color, the more correlated they are. And here they are actually all positively associated. So tau is between 0 and 1 in this particular example. So now when you look at the picture, you probably don't see very much. It looks very messy, very noisy. So what are we going to do with it? And of course, as a statistician, my job is to find the signal, to find some pattern in this haystack of correlation numbers. And of course, that's not easy to do. So I needed some smart people to get involved. And in particular, one of my PhD students who did his undergrad here at McGill, and then he continued in an actuarial program at Laval, and then came back from a PhD, which he did with me and my colleague Thierry Duchesne at Laval. He just defended now in 2020. He's a very smart guy now as a postdoc in Toronto. And so what we thought of doing together is devising an algorithm that can sort of find the signal in such a matrix. And to do that, you need to assume something. So what we thought of assuming is that actually these variables, these stocks, can be grouped into non-overlapping groups, such that the correlation between members of the same group is the same correlation. But of course, you may have different correlations for different groups. And also the correlation between two different groups is always the same. But again, it can depend on which two groups you pick. Assuming that there is such a block structure, can we devise an algorithm to find it? So what it means, we need to find the groups. We have no idea what they are, how many we have. We want to learn that from data. And once we have these groups, can we somehow use it to reduce this incredible amount of noise that we saw in the picture? And so let me share with you what Samuel managed to do with the help of me and my team. So he managed to do that, to find an algorithm to identify these groups. So here is the same matrix again. It's just that the variables have been ordered in a different way. They have been just ordered all members from group 1, all members from group 2, and so forth. We identified about 16 different groups of stocks. And when you look at the picture this time, suddenly you see that there is some kind of a pattern emerging, right? And now I'm going to use this technique further to smooth the matrix. So when you look still at this picture, there are 5,671 correlations. That's a lot for a sample size of 180. So there is really a lot of noise. So now let me reduce the noise and show you this guy. So that's a lot cleaner, and you can actually identify beautifully various industry sectors. And that's what people do in econometrics, in various econometrics models, but they don't learn that from the data, they just infer it from the context. But here is really a rigorous way to learn these groups from the data and to check which industry sectors can be merged and so forth. So this is just one example of the kind of work I'm doing with my students and collaborators, but there is a lot more. And there is, of course, hopefully a lot more for some of you to do if you come and join me. So on these words, thank you very much for your attention, and also to all the granting agencies and McGill that's been supporting me throughout my career here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johanna. That's, again, a great story, and so interesting to see and hear of the different fields that your techniques can be applied to. It's truly generalizable. Our last speaker for this evening is Professor Brian Robinson. He's in the Department of Geography. over to you, Brian.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Brian. I'm in geography, and my work sits at the intersection of environmental sustainability and international development. So you can think about sustainability-related issues and the environment and how we don't want to destroy the environment, we want to preserve it. We can also think about international development, thinking about improving welfare and quality of life for people in countries that are still developing. And these two contexts sometimes collide, and if you try to improve one, then it comes at the expense of the other. But there are some cases where you can actually find ways to make both work together, or at least find the people that are most important for both to work together for. And so part of the context that I'm working in is looking at often people that are living in situations where they depend directly on the environment for their livelihoods and for their well-being. So this is an example of a study that I just completed a few years ago, looking at dependence on what I call ecosystem services. And so these are like the things that you get from the landscape to help support your life and livelihoods. And in this study, we looked at places where the landscape services, these ecosystem services, were either increasing or decreasing. And then we also looked at places where people's utilization of those things were increasing or decreasing, and we're able to find places that seemed like they might be more vulnerable to some of these ecosystem service changes, and other places where it wasn't a critical issue at all. So that's the map that we see here, and we can look at those dependence values and see how they're correlated with other things, with health or other measures of welfare and well-being. So this is one kind of study that I'm involved in. I also do work on inequality and the urban environment. So I'm co-leading a project on looking at poverty and inequality in 6 different cities across the world. 3 of these cities are in transitioning or developing economies, and 2 of them are in more industrialized economies. So London and Vancouver are the industrialized cities. This is actually a picture of Accra, the capital of Ghana. And in this study, we've been able to do a really fine-scaled mapping of the distribution of socioeconomic status or income, and at this very fine spatial scale to really understand not just where the poor live, but also where the whole range of the distribution of people in their socioeconomic status characteristics, where they live, and then look at how that relates to the environments that they're living in. And then finally, I have a set of studies that really focus more on policy evaluation. So looking at some of these environmental or development policies and seeing how they either achieve the kinds of outcomes that they hope to achieve, or are there unintended consequences? We have lots of policies where there are unintended consequences. And so it's important to take stock of those and measure those and try to help policymakers understand when you're going to run into those issues and when you're not. So part of my work takes a policy that's been implemented and really tries to look at, is it doing what it's supposed to be doing, and what are the outcomes and impacts both for nature and for people. Look forward to talking to those of you that are interested in the breakout rooms after. That's all for me.
Thank you, Brian. Again, a great story. Before I pass the meeting over to the organizers, Priti and Eduardo, I want to personally thank all of our speakers for coming this evening. I hope we've reached, by having the evening session of Soup and Science, I hope we've reached a much broader range of our students and colleagues in the time zones around the world. This way, I hope we've certainly been able to reach those people in the West Coast and the Pacific. My one comment, but it's repetitive because I've been saying it for years. It's just breathtaking when I hear what is happening in the Faculty of Science under your leadership, the 4 of you. but always involve students. The amazing thing of this evening, but it's always the amazing thing, is just how much science is about people. Every one of these stories is about the impact directly on people and society and the future of society. So thank you.